Brilliant, thank you. Good afternoon. Firstly, a very big apology. The audio output on my laptop, my brand new laptop, just blew on me completely, which, considering I have a screen reader that I really need to hear, and I have some slides that contain some audio and video that I'd really quite like you to hear, it was a bit of a showstopper. So thank you particularly to Harry and Dora for jumping up the schedule and giving me some breathing space to figure it out, and to Jo for lending me her laptop. So hopefully, fingers crossed, everything will work from here on in. Web performance, conference topic, of course. A very simple definition of the term is the speed at which pages are downloaded and usable by users. So there's a couple of terms I want to pick up on in that definition. The first is browsers. On the desktop, we've got 4 of the usual suspects that'll be familiar to all of us, so that part of the description is pretty easy to understand. It's the tool that we use to access web content, of course. But what about the users? And specifically, for the purposes of this talk, what about those of us who use assistive technologies like screen readers? If you're not familiar, a screen reader is a piece of software that translates what most people see on screen into synthetic speech, and for some people, into refreshable electronic braille. And there are screen readers available on every platform. And I'm going to focus on desktop platforms for this talk because it's the way that screen readers and browsers work together on the desktop that's particularly important to performance when you have an assistive technology like a screen reader running. But there are integrated screen readers on Windows 10 in the shape of Narrator, on all Apple products in the shape of VoiceOver, and on Windows you also have another couple of options, NVDA, which is an open source screen reader, and JAWS, which is a proprietary screen reader. There's also Orca, which is available on Linux. So there is choice. No matter what platform you use, there is a screen reader available. So a quick demo now. Screen readers are pretty versatile things. They can do things like just read passages of text out loud.
Heading level 1 using the ARIA current attribute posted in link code things on January 14th, 2017. It is common on the web for the current thing in a collection to be highlighted visually, but providing an alternative for screen reader users has often involved something of a hack. The link ARIA current attribute is intended to solve this problem.
So it's very easy with a screen reader just to read pieces of content. Screen readers are also pretty good at picking up on other useful bits of information about the code, like the lang attribute, for example.
L'eau monte au fur et à mesure de la fonte des neiges.
L'eau monte au fur et à mesure de la fonte des neiges.
So that's literally the difference between exactly the same piece of code being spoken aloud or the same text. The only difference being is that one has the French code lang applied in the attribute and the other doesn't. So screen readers are pretty adept at figuring out what's going on and changing their behavior accordingly. If we look back in our history a little way, in the late 1990s, what screen readers used to do was consume the HTML directly. So the browser would consume the HTML when it was loaded and do its own thing, and screen readers would also consume the HTML and do their own thing. And at the same time as doing that, they would produce something known as a virtual buffer, or a virtual alternative to what was shown visually on screen. It's worth bearing in mind that back in the late 90s, there wasn't a screen reader for Apple products, for macOS. There had been one, but it stopped being produced in about 97. So until then, until VoiceOver came along in the mid-2000s, Windows was pretty much the only option for screen reader users. With this virtual model, what it gave screen reader users the ability to do was to navigate content in much more interesting ways than just by listening to something from top to bottom. In the virtual model, the screen reader could say, hey, give me a list of all the headings on the page, and give users a way to navigate using those, for example.
Tink heading level 1. Regaining site heading level 2 link. Playing with the accessibility object model AOM heading level 2 link. Accessible SVG line graphs heading level 2 link.
And so screen readers got very good at recognizing all kinds of different HTML elements. Another quick example is buttons.
Categories button collapsed. Tags button collapsed. Another blogs button collapsed. Conferences button collapsed.
So screen readers are picking up both the text labels from those buttons, and in this case, because they've got a state attached to them about their expansion or collapsed state, making that information available too. But for the longest time, all this interaction for screen reader users happened in the screen reader's virtual alternative to the page. What happened by the time we got round to the early 2000s is that screen readers began using platform accessibility APIs to access information from the browser. What used to happen before that is that screen readers used to guess. So, for example, they would intercept the video signal as it was being sent to the video output device, the monitor or whatever it may be, the graphics card, and if it saw something that was, say, vaguely rectangular shaped with some apparent text representation in the middle, and it was on a horizontal plane with a whole bunch of other things that looked pretty much the same size and shape, it would assume that was probably a menu, and that's the sort of information it would convey to the user. That's a horribly inefficient way to do things. It's really not performant at all. It takes far too much guesswork. Screen readers needed to be scripted very heavily for specific applications, so anything changes, then the scripting in the screen reader needed to change, and the whole process was pretty damn horrible. The accessibility APIs changed that because it enabled the screen readers to say to anything in the operating system or an application or in web content, what are you? What is your purpose? Tell me about you. What are your characteristics? What's your role? What's your name? What do I call you? What state are you in at the moment? So, like all good APIs, it gave us a much more efficient way of getting information out of applications, browsers, and web content for the purposes of being used by a screen reader. The accessibility APIs are available, like screen readers, on all platforms. Windows has 3 presently, Mac has 1, Linux has 2. They're also available on mobile platforms, but it doesn't matter which platform you're using at the moment. The assistive technologies that you can use on those platforms will all use these APIs to get at this information. For the moment, these are only usable by assistive technologies. As developers, we can't use them. They're just bound into the operating system and the applications that use it. So let's take a quick look at how all this works. If we take the details and summary elements that were introduced in HTML5, just a very simple code example. When we load it into the browser, of course, you'll know that the browser creates the DOM, and that's the bit, as developers, we most often interact with, and it's important to performance. In Edge, browsers will render it in a fairly flat content style because Edge doesn't support the interaction of the details and summary elements yet, so the browser provides one form of visual rendering. In a browser like Firefox, where it is implemented and supported, the browser provides the visual rendering and also the interaction necessary to use it. So we can already start to see the reveal widget being usable just for the base of having those 2 elements in the browser. What the browser also does is create something known as the accessibility tree. It's a sister hierarchy to the DOM, but it contains only accessibility information. So if we were to look at what's in the accessibility tree for the summary element, we'd find out that it has a role of button, because to all intents and purposes, that's exactly what it is when you see it rendered on screen. We'd also see that it can be focused on and that it has a state. In its default state, it is collapsed, but it has the potential to be expanded. And screen readers and other assistive technologies will use the APIs to get at the information in the accessibility tree and use that information to give the user something to work with.
Tequila ... button collapsed. Enter. Tequila ... button expanded. Makes me happy.
So there's a lot going on when the browser starts to load its code. It loads the DOM. If there's an assistive technology like a screen reader running, it also has to create the accessibility tree. The screen reader then has to query the accessibility tree for the information and make that information available to the user, sometimes by default, sometimes on demand. So the performance picture, as you can probably well imagine, is already starting to change. There's a lot more going on under the hood than you might think when there's a screen reader into the equation. Now, here we are in the late 10s. All screen readers use these accessibility APIs, but something has changed very recently. Not all screen readers now create that virtual alternative of the document. And the reason for that is the different ways in which different modern browsers handle their processes for the application and the content. So we originally had a single process model, a single process in the browser that handled the entire lot, the application, the content, the functionality, the visual rendering, the whole 9 yards. And for very good reasons, we moved away from doing that. And now what we have in all browsers is a multi-process model, where you have a process that oversees the application and one or more processes for content and processes for many of the other typical functions like graphics rendering and other interactive points. And this is a much more safe, secure, stable model, so it's definitely a good thing. One thing to bear in mind about the different processing models is that it changes something about the way assistive technologies communicate. There are two ways in which a screen reader can communicate with the browser. There's in-process communication, which is where the screen reader pretty much sits inside the browser. It's a very symbiotic relationship, and it can query information from within the browser's application process. There's also out-of-bound communication, where the screen reader is completely excluded from the browser entirely, and all the communication has to be handled strictly through the APIs via the operating system level. And these two differences are pretty key to the way performance changes. So if we have a look at the different multi-process models that are there in browsers, we'll start with the one everybody loves to hate, Internet Explorer. It has a multi-process model. Actually, it was the first browser to introduce multi-processing, although not to the level of strength that we see in terms of separation between processes in most modern browsers. But the reason I mention it is because what IE does is let the screen reader sit inside the application process, but it also gives the screen reader from there absolutely direct access to the content process. So the screen reader is injected into the application process, but there's absolutely nothing sitting between it and the content processes either. So this has some advantages. It's reasonably performant. It's very, very quick for the screen reader to send its queries into the content processes of the browser, slurp up all the HTML that it needs, create the virtual document, and present that first piece of information to a screen reader user, which incidentally is usually the title of the page announced automatically. As we know with these kind of more single process style situations, stability is a huge problem. And in accessibility terms, it's even worse with Internet Explorer. If the screen reader crashes, and believe me, they're quite prone to doing that, it's quite likely to take the browser out with it. And vice versa, if the browser crashes, it will take your screen reader out with it. The latter being slightly more catastrophic when you need your screen reader to try and bail yourself out of the situation. So lovely in terms of a fast time to interaction if you're a screen reader user, not so lovely in terms of catastrophic calamity when it all goes wrong. If we take a look at the multi-process models in Chrome and Firefox, we've got some slightly different ways of approaching things here. Again, the screen reader is able to sit inside the application process, but in neither of these browsers does it have direct access to the content process or content processes, depending on which browser you're talking about. Google was the first one to do this with Chrome, and the initial approach that they took was to proxy all the queries via the accessibility APIs into the content process. So the screen reader would sit inside the application process, send a query to the content process, the browser would handle that query, get the information from the content process, send it back to the application process, the screen reader would do its thing, and eventually the user would get its information. It won't come as any surprise to you at this point to discover that that was pretty useless in terms of performance if you happen to be a screen reader user. And Google recognized this pretty quickly, to their credit. And they switched to their current approach. What Chrome does is when it detects that a screen reader is running, it creates the accessibility tree, and that happens within the content process. It then caches the entire accessibility tree back over to the application process where the screen reader sits. So there's a kind of an initial hit on the creation of the accessibility tree and the caching. But once that has happened, the screen reader has incredibly performant access to the accessibility tree. So particularly on larger pages, there's a noticeable delay, but on smaller pages, it's very, very quick. And either way, once you've kind of got there, the interaction is pretty performant there. So if I give you a bit of an example, taking a very large page to really painfully make the point. The ARIA 1.1 specification is pretty ginormous, and this is how one screen reader will interact with it and do all those things I was just talking about.
Enter. Accessible Rich Internet Applications ARIA 1.1. Two regions, 288 headings and 4,949 links. Accessible Rich Internet Applications ARIA 1.1.
So that first piece of text you heard was the title being announced out loud, and that's pretty much the equivalent of most people's time to first interaction, time to first render, but the delay of 4 or 5 seconds before the screen reader had got hold of the accessibility tree cache was pretty noticeable. It's a long time, especially when we know in general performance terms that a delay of a second is enough to have a serious impact on things like conversion rates. I think Tammy mentioned earlier that the average person thinks they spend about 2 days a year waiting for pages to load. I guess by this measure, a screen reader user probably spends at least 2 or 3 times as much days waiting for things to load. But as I say, the counterbalance is this is a particularly large page, so it's a particularly large delay, and once you've got to it, interaction is pretty quick. Firefox, on the other hand, takes a slightly different approach. It does what Google set out to do originally, which is process all the API queries into the content process, but it uses intelligent caching to take some of the sting out of the performance hit. So when the screen reader sends through a query for, say, a piece of text on the page, Firefox decides, if you want to know about that piece of text, you're probably also going to want to know a lot of related information, like the font face, the font color, the font size, maybe the link that's inside the text. And it will intelligently try to bundle up information. So when you query for one piece of information, the screen reader gets a whole bunch of other things in return that, in theory, makes that process a bit more intelligent and a bit more efficient than it was when Google first attempted it. The interesting thing is that it makes it time to interaction reasonably good, but when they introduced the quantum engine, none of this worked terribly well. There were serious problems for screen reader users in Firefox 57, and they remained actually until sometime late yesterday afternoon when Firefox 60 was released. It was more or less unusable for those times. Firefox actually recommended that if you used a screen reader, you should go back to using an old legacy version of Firefox 52 that they maintained for the purpose. But literally, news as of the Firefox 60 update yesterday is that a lot of these performance problems have been solved. And I did a quick test earlier this morning on that same ARIA page, and there is still a bit of a delay in the first time to interaction for a screen reader user, but it's probably 2 or 3 seconds. So it's back of a packet testing, but it seems to be on a par at least with Chrome. So that's really good news if they've managed to sort that out. If we look at Edge, which of course also is multi-process, things take a step in a very different direction. Not only can the screen reader not have access to the content process, but it actually can't have access to the browser at all. And this is where we move into out-of-process communication. So the screen reader sits nowhere near the browser. Every time it wants to use a platform accessibility API to query some information about browser content, it has to send that query via the operating system to the browser. That picks up all the information, and it sends it back to the screen reader. And as you might imagine, this causes some interesting challenges. It means that there is sometimes good performance because all the screen reader has to do is just query the first piece of information it thinks the user is going to want to know about. So in that respect, it's very, very quick. It just gives the minimum amount of information in its query and gives that information to the screen reader. Every time the screen reader wants to do something with the page, be it read a heading or a piece of text, that involves another round of queries, though, and that has some really interesting side effects. It basically means that the screen readers that work on Windows, JAWS and NVDA, and also Narrator, do not create a virtual model of the page. Everything is done by an API call. There is no concept of the virtual model, so a lot of functionality is reduced. Marco Zehi of Mozilla estimates that to go down this route of querying and out-of-process communication is somewhere between 12 and 50 times slower than having the browser with the ability to sit inside the application process. So slowing down that whole process to let the screen reader grab all the information about the page out of the accessibility tree in order to create a virtual model would be pretty much impossible. We'd all be there till Christmas waiting for this to actually happen. It's worth mentioning Narrator, the integrated screen reader on Windows. It doesn't use a virtual model either, but of course it helps when the screen reader, the OS, the API, and the browser are all developed by the same organization. They have a much more closely knit working arrangement. And so for the moment, Narrator is actually, despite the limitations of having to use out-of-process communications, extremely performant with Edge. It's also worth noting that VoiceOver, the integrated screen reader on Safari or on macOS, works in the same way. And again, because it's got that same organizational oversight for all the different parts of the stack, it too is reasonably performant despite not using a virtual model. So what can we do about all this? What can we do to make things more performant, even in browsers like Edge, where there is that complete sandboxing protection? We could perhaps drop the virtual model entirely. That's certainly what the team at Firefox are advocating for. But it's not as simple as that, because, as I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, when the virtual model came along, it actually introduced a whole bunch of functionality and features that are really, really useful to screen reader users. So, for example, if we didn't have the virtual model, this is what it would take to select a piece of text on a web page, perhaps because we want to copy it somewhere.
Selected. Heading level 2 link regaining site question. Selected. Space. Selected. Posted in. Selected. Link real life. Selected. On October 12th, 2017. Selected. Space. Selected. People often presume I would jump at the chance to be able to see again.
So it's not really hard work. You just hold down the Shift key and then keep hitting the arrow key until you've selected all the text. But I quite like doing things with a cup of tea in one hand, so having to use two hands was just a non-starter from the get-go. So I quite like the virtual model because it lets the screen reader that I use introduce features like this, where I can just drop two markers on the page and in one key press tell my screen reader to select everything between the two markers.
Temporary place marker set. Regaining site article. Regaining site article end. Space. Selecting between marked place and current position.
And that's it. But we couldn't do that if we didn't have the virtual model. So if we're going to do away with it entirely for performance reasons, we've really got to rethink how a lot of this really useful functionality is available. We also need to think about improving the APIs themselves. What Edge has done in restricting everything to API communication makes a lot of sense in some regards, but the APIs themselves have really got to get their act together. We need them to be able to provide the screen reader with all the information it needs to do all the things it can in the virtual model. So, for example, some of the platform accessibility APIs won't let the screen reader query for a list of all the headings on the page. So that heading navigation we saw at the beginning becomes really, really difficult at the moment and certainly has an impact on performance if the screen reader tries to do it. There are also some pretty glaring holes as well. So, for example, in UIA, one of the, or the newer accessibility API on Windows, it doesn't let you query information from inside an iframe if you happen to be searching using Edge. So you get things like this.
JAWS finds dialog. Find what? Edit combo. Right here. Alt plus W. Enter. Example Microsoft Edge. Screen find result dialog. Search string not found. OK button.
So content that is literally right in front of everybody else's eyes is apparently non-existent to a screen reader that's forced to use UIA to query content on the screen because UIA doesn't recognize the content for searchability inside an iframe. So we've got some pretty damn big holes to fix in some of these APIs before we can think about dropping the virtual model. So what can you do about all of this? It's all very well me talking about the impact that screen readers have on performance. The truth is that most of what you do for good performance will have a beneficial impact on accessibility performance. The more performant your website is to begin with, the lesser problems it's going to cause from an accessibility point of view. So there is a definite relationship between general performance and accessibility performance. The other thing, of course, you can do is just be aware that there is this going to be additional delay for a lot of screen reader users, particularly on large content or large pages. If you're rewriting huge amounts of the DOM, that's probably going to be a pretty significant hit on screen reader performance as well. I mentioned that there are screen readers available on pretty much every platform. When you deploy something, just get used to turning on that screen reader and loading up a page for the first time and just ticking off the seconds until you can actually first start interacting with it. So not just the time when you hear the first bit of speech, but actually the first time when you can start hitting some keys and do something meaningful and useful with the content. I'm going to leave you with one final thought, but before I go, there's a number of people I really do owe some thanks to. All of the people up on screen were extremely patient when I pestered them with questions. There are people who know about accessibility and screen reader performance, mostly in the browsers created by their respective companies, but without them, I wouldn't have had a hope of being able to talk about this at all. Never mind, I hope as usefully as I believe this talk has been. The final thought I want to leave you with, though, is that we all talk about performance. The thing we're really, really interested in, of course, is human performance. We can talk about, all the metrics we like in terms of what happens in the browser. Time to interaction is probably the closest thing we've got to reality. Because the truth of the matter is that humans are not patient. Our patience is subjective. If we're feeling pretty chilled out and we're just, reading the news or something, then actually we might be a little more content to wait a second or so while something loads. If we're furiously in a hurry, racing for a meeting, desperately need to look up the venue, we're going to be much less patient with that. So it's human performance that's really got to be at the absolute heart of everything we think about in terms of technical performance. And the reason I want to say this more than anything is that screen reader users tend to do things pretty damn fast. We're even less possibly patient than most people. But there is the audio equivalent of just visually skimming content. So you might casually glance down a page to find something interesting or just to take it in very, very quickly at a high level. This is the speed that I tend to listen to my screen reader at. So if you hear this, perhaps you'll understand how much performance really does matter if you're a screen reader user.
Heading level 1 using the ARIA current attribute posted in link code things on January 14th, 2017. It is common on the web for the current thing in a collection to be highlighted visually, but providing an alternative for screen reader users has often involved something of a hack. The link ARIA current attribute is intended to solve this problem. Heading level 2 common.
So that's screen reader performance at full pelt. So that's kind of what we're aiming for, is that kind of level of impatience and ability to move in an agile and meaningful way through content. And I hope this has been useful. And once again, thank you very much for your patience in the schedule rebumping. Thank you.